The big question at the centre of the novel is, what will a mother do for her son? Or what won't she do? And the what won't she do turns out to be a really short list.
Welcome, Annie, to the British History podcast and channel. Thank you so much for joining me here at Harvington Hall. You've just done your In Conversation with Nicola Tallis about your new book. That was so fascinating.
Oh, thank you so much.
Really fascinating. So your new book is The King's Mother.
Yes.
A sequel, is it, to Cecily?
Yes, I guess it is. I mean, you could read it as a standalone, but yes, it is. If you take the two books together, they're the complete story of a life, if you like. So yes, it takes us right through. If you read both books, it takes us right through from the beginning of the Wars of the Roses to the bitter end.
Right.
Yeah. But it looks at the Wars of the Roses through the women's eyes, not the men.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, quite a key theme as to even how come you came to writing.
Yes.
So I want to ask you about your writing and how you came to it. But let's first of all, can you give people a bit of an overview as to what The King's Mother is about and who the main characters are?
Yeah, I can. So The King's Mother opens at Easter 1461, at which point Edward IV has just won the Battle of Towton and become Edward IV. He's just become king. Mm-hmm. So the novel opens in the middle of a great regime change between Lancaster and York. And we then look at the whole story of his reign and subsequently the reign of Richard III. So it's that Yorkist dynasty, how that dynasty rises and then how that dynasty eventually falls. But the story is told through the eyes really of four women, and who are to me the big sort of four powerhouse women of the Wars of the Roses. And telling the stories of the wars through the female lens changes the story completely. Because, it's the Wars of the Roses, it's about blokes running around with swords, right? But it's the women who are actually determining the action and doing so much. And those four women are Cecily Neville, who is Edward IV's mum, and she is the first of the King's mothers. She's actually the first woman in England to take that title, King's Mother, as a sort of formal title rather than just a sort of biological fact, if you like. Mm-hmm. She stops being Cecily, Duchess of York, and she becomes the Lady Cecily, the King's Mother. It's her formal role, which is, I think, her way of saying, don't for a minute imagine that there's anyone more important than me in this room.
Does she give herself that title?
Yes, she assumes that for herself and inhabits it very well. And then in the course of the novel, there are three other women who at various times and for various reasons and with various degrees of cunning and treacherous intent will do just about anything to put their boy on the throne and become King's Mother themselves. So it's really about how the wars are shaped by women. My publisher talks about this book as a tale of maternal ferocity. And in a way, I guess it is.
It's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. I guess at the centre of the novel, the big question at the centre of the novel is, what will a mother do for her son? Or what won't she do? And the what won't she do turns out to be a really short list. And these women will do really quite desperate and definitely morally questionable things in their efforts to either retain the throne for their son or to win the throne for their son. And they will all, in various ways, betray one another.
Listening to you talking with Nicola Tallis there was a couple of things that sprung out sort of to me. And I suppose they're interrelated. One is you talked about how gaps or mysteries in the story or in the Wars of the Roses, actually, if you start looking at the women, you start to be able to fill in those gaps or solve those mysteries.
Yeah.
And that is linked to the fact that these women knew each other. They're not just appendages of their husbands or sons. They had relationship
Yeah,
independent
intimate
of that.
relationships. And it's fascinating because, you know, I was reading about and studying these women for years before that really the penny dropped. And once it dropped, I thought, well, how could I have missed that? How, you know, it's so obvious. But the way we're taught history, we're not looking at female networks and female relationships, generally speaking. We're looking at the blokes. And if the women happen to drift into the picture, we'll have a quick glance at them before we move on to the next bloke. And all of these women were deeply connected. You know, Marguerite of Anjou, Cecily was the first woman Marguerite of Anjou met when she was coming from France to England to marry Henry VI when she was a young girl of 15. And Cecily, who was stationed in Rouen at the time with her husband, entertained her for a couple of weeks over Easter before she came to England. And they became friends. They had a very good working relationship. They were the number one, number two women in the country, I guess you could say. And they worked very well together until the relationship between their houses became irreparably fell apart, and they became the bitterest of enemies. But they knew each other really well. And that meant they knew how hard each other were going to fight too. Elizabeth Woodville, who marries Edward IV scandalously, is the daughter of one of Cecily's good friends. Her mother was Jacquetta of Bedford, and Cecily first met Jacquetta when the two of them were 16 years old, and they'd each gone to, Cecily had gone to France for the coronation of Henry VI, which happened to coincide with the execution of Joan of Arc, interestingly. Jacquetta was there, and they met each other then and remained friends, associates, all through their lives. And when they were both young mothers in France, a little later, when they were both young wives and were having lots of children, they were part of that sort of English enclave in France. You can imagine them spending time together as young mums, you know. So they knew each other very well. And then Margaret Beaufort, of course, was Cecily's cousin. You know, Margaret was a Beaufort. Cecily's mum was Joan Beaufort. So they were deeply connected by friendships, by family, by political allegiance sometimes, you know. And when you think of it, that sort of aristocratic gene pool was relatively small. So these women knew each other more than you would imagine, and they interacted more than you can imagine. And that makes those betrayals, when they come, so much more bitter. Because it's not a distant enemy, you know, it's someone you know really well, and you're going to drive the knife between their ribs, metaphorically, or literally, perhaps. But yeah, there's lots of love.
It's personal.
It's personal, it's visceral, and it hurts. Yeah.
Which makes them, it helps to make them the humans that they are, which is difficult in how we're taught history, I think.
Yeah.
So was that one of your aims in becoming a history fiction writer? To sort of be because in the non-fiction realm, you're very constrained as to what you can sort of say and not say. Do you find in fiction you can bring out their personalities and make them more human?
Not only that you can, but that you must.
Yeah.
Because I spent a lot of time when I was writing these books thinking, you know, as a writer, how do you make sure that your reader is completely locked in, and to the point where, you know, when you're sitting up at 3 o'clock in the morning, when you know you've got to get up to go to work the next day, but you've just got to read another chapter to find out, and you're reading page after page. How do you do that? How do you create that suspense when it's historical fiction and most people know what happens?
Yeah.
Because we all know that Henry VII is going to win in the end, right? So you're not turning the pages at midnight to find out what happens. You're turning the pages at midnight to find out what it feels like for these characters. And for that to happen, you've got to make your reader totally invested in those characters and in those people. It doesn't mean they have to like them, it doesn't mean they have to love them, but it means they have to be able to empathise and connect somehow with the humanity of these people who are so different to us and lived at a very different time, but have feelings in common with us around motherhood and love and parenting and envy and rage and all of those things that we feel and they felt then. So it's always been that human connection, the telling of stories that has been interesting to me. And oddly, that started with my history teacher, because way back when I was in school, about another millennia ago, I went to a really bad school, but I had a kind of marvellous history teacher who was a bit mad and definitely eccentric, but massively enthusiastic. And at a time when most history teachers were just force-feeding kids with dates and facts, he was telling stories. He was talking about the people. So that idea that story and history are almost impossible to pull apart was sort of fixed in my head very, very early. Really.
How do you balance the fact with then the bits that you have to put in to elaborate on those facts? How do you balance that?
Yeah, it's really hard, because and I do feel a huge responsibility to try and get the history as right as I possibly can. You know, I get a bit Star Trek about it. You know, don't mess with the past because you'll screw up the future if you do that. You know, sort of be really diligent and know the history, inhabit the history. And if something happened in such and such a way, let's not pretend that it didn't. You know, that's how it was. But there's so much about this period in particular that we either don't know or that is so open to interpretation. I mean, you could fill this room with historians and they would argue black is white, and they'll end up fisticuffs about certain events during the Wars of the Roses. You know,
that would be a history festival to go to, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I've been to a few of them. It's so easy for it all to go horribly wrong. And that's where the novelist can really get to work, I suppose, and say, well, you know, if we know what A is and we know what C is, but we don't know what B is, given A and C, and the personalities of the characters involved, what is B likely to be? What is credible? What is believable? What is defensible? And I always say to people, you might read my books and you might look at my interpretation of a certain event and think, I think that's wrong, I don't agree with that, I have a different opinion about what happened. And that's completely fine, because a lot of those things are up for grabs and we're not totally sure. But I want to be able to say in my own mind that I portrayed that event in that way because of this evidence, or because of this. You know, it has to be defensible. That I have to be able to stand up and defend it and say this is credible and it could well have happened this way.
You came to writing after a full career in business, I believe. What made you want to become a writer?
Well, I never aimed to be a writer. I aimed to tell this story. So the idea for these novels, telling this story of the women of the Wars of the Roses, was born in my head really when I was in my late teens and early 20s. And my plan A was that I would go to university, leave university, get a job in publishing and write these novels at the same time. And I thought that would be lovely. You know, I'll be working with books all day, and then at night and in the weekends I'll be writing books, and that would be just perfect. But this was back in the 80s, and I don't think it's that different now, but most of the young women working in publishing then were called Polly and they were engaged to Rupert.
Yeah.
You know? Or they had a trust fund from Daddy, and it didn't matter that they earned tuppence a month, you know. And I had neither a Rupert nor a trust fund, and the wage was pitiful, and I was working in pubs at night and bookshops at the weekend just to pay rent in London. And there was no time to write. So I thought, this is totally unfeasible, so I need a plan B. So plan B was go into business proper, make a living, girls got to live. But at 55, I would give up the day job, whatever it was by then, and write The Women of the Wars of the Roses. So I did. So in 2017, I was 55 and I gave up my day job and I wrote the first novel, Cecily, and then The King's Mum. Yeah.
That's wonderful to have that life plan. I admire that greatly. So you came to it specifically, to specifically write about the women of the Wars of the Roses. So did you have maybe preconceptions of the women you were going to write about, and were they challenged, and in what way were they challenged?
The one where my opinion of them and my feelings toward them changed the most was Margaret Beaufort. And I'd always thought badly of her. But in the writing of these books and spending time with her, as it were, my admiration for her and my sympathy for her just grew out of all proportion, because that woman was so brave. You know, when I think of the risks that she took to put Henry on the throne, and you know, it was her plan. She did it. She made the plan. She executed the plan. She paid for the plan, and she took all of the associated risks. It was phenomenal, and she must have had nerves of steel. You know, in 1484, it almost became all unstuck, and she was caught in treason and arrested, and could well have expected to be executed. And yet, she held her nerve and came back and had another go. And it makes my blood run cold. She was so utterly determined and so utterly pragmatic about what she had to do. Stop at nothing, Margaret, you know. Yeah, incredible woman. And when you think at the other end of her life, you know, her start in life was so bitter and so difficult. You know, as you probably know, her father died when she was very young, and she became a very sort of wealthy heiress on the marriage market. And Henry VI at the time married her to his half-brother Edmund Tudor, and it was really a way of giving Edmund land and titles and money and whatnot without the king having to actually spend any money. And she was 12 years old when she married Edmund, and there's nothing unusual in that. Girls that age and younger married all the time. But usually those marriages wouldn't be consummated till the girl was about 16 or so. But there was a problem with the way the marriage contract was written for Margaret, which meant that if she died before there'd been issue from that marriage, all that lovely titles and land and whatnot wouldn't go to Edmund, it would revert to the crown. So he was very keen that there should be issue as soon as possible. So at 12 years old, he took her to bed and he got her pregnant. And she gave birth to Henry when she was barely 13, by which time she was already a widow, because Edmund had contrived to die of the plague in the meantime. So his plans went really well, didn't they? And that was the only child she ever had. She married twice subsequently. She never had any other children. Interestingly, from that point on, she negotiated all of her own marriage contracts. She didn't leave it to anybody else. And she never had any other children. And that son was her passion and her dedication. In her correspondence to him, she refers to him as my one desired joy in all the world. It's just, it's so admirable, and it's so human, and it's so, you know, pitiful too, in a way, when you think of that early start. So,
well, also, what strikes me with Margaret's life is the end was tragic as well. She watches the almost the dynasty unravel in that Arthur dies, Elizabeth of York then dies, her son, and obviously a few years later, and she just about sees Henry VIII come to the throne, and then it's almost like, okay, I'm off.
Yeah. How bitter it must have been to her when Henry died, her son, you know, that she had outlived him. And yeah, she stayed around just about long enough to help organise Henry VIII's coronation.
Yeah. Doesn't even leave the building.
Of course. Yeah. You know, the marriage to Catherine. She was very much involved in all of that, both the marriage to Arthur and the marriage to Henry. So, I don't know, my feeling is always she was going to hang on to the bitter end till she saw, you know, that next step for the dynasty. Let's get the crown on Henry's head, and then my job's done, I'm going. Yeah.
Well, we'll end it with Margaret. So thank you so much, Annie. Congratulations again on your book. I mean, what was it? The Times Book of the month it was released. It's amazing. Awesome. So, where can people find you online?
My website, anniegarthwaite.com, and you can sign up there for news, and you can email me from there. And then on social media, on Instagram and X and all of those places as Annie Garthwaite.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you so much.